you watch this show regularly, then you may have noticed that until recently, I would occasionally read advertisements for various online gambling companies. Every time I did one of those ad reads, somebody in the comment section would object. They would accuse me of promoting immoral and unchristian behavior, of having no principles, corrupting the youth, and so on. And on top of that, I was accused of shilling for products that I didn't use. Now, the truth is that I read those advertisements because at the time, I supported legalized gambling, including sports betting, and I have placed bets myself, especially on NFL games. In moderation, my perspective was that sports betting is no different from any other entertainment-related expense, as long as you don't turn gambling into a lifestyle, which is something that I've never done or been tempted to do, then I didn't see much of a problem with it. And for people who take things too far, my attitude has been that it's not the government's job to save people from the consequences of their own bad decisions. If you voluntarily take on a financial risk that backfires, well, that's your issue. Shouldn't have done that. And that's genuinely how I felt. And in many ways, in many other situations, I still feel that way. I don't believe that the arguments for legalized gambling are spurious or unserious. But starting today, I've decided that we are not going to have any more gambling ads on this show. All gambling sponsors are banned from the show from this point forward. And that's because I've changed my mind. I think I was wrong. And I want to explain why. I think that there is now substantial evidence that gambling has some of the same corrosive effects on young people, on society at large, but young people in particular, as legalized marijuana use. And years ago, you've probably heard me mention this before, I also supported legalizing marijuana. And my opinion changed, though, after seeing the impact that it has had on society. My view on legalized gambling has evolved in the same way and for the same reason. Now, yes, if one person, smokes a bowl on occasion, it's not going to destroy society. The problem is that a huge preponderance of people will not smoke weed in moderation. It becomes a habit. It affects their development. It dulls their interests in things that actually matter in life. At a certain point, for weed smokers, marijuana becomes a way of life. And meanwhile, for everybody else, the weed smokers are, at best a nuisance and oftentimes much more than that. They actively degrade our quality of life. It's a clear net negative on society in general. Nobody wants to share the roads with somebody who's high, or eat food prepared by someone who's high, or attend a class full of students who are high. But increasingly, these are unavoidable scenarios. These are the externalities of marijuana use. There are real costs that are inflicted on innocent people. And now you can't walk through any city without smelling the stench of weed everywhere and seeing people walking around like zombies, stoned out of their minds. That is the inevitable result of the mass legalization and acceptance of this drug, and we're seeing it all around us. Gambling presents similar problems. It greatly diminishes the lives of millions of people, especially young men, in a variety of ways that aren't always obvious. And it's scamming people, including experienced gamblers, in ways that aren't remotely apparent. They weren't apparent to me either when I first accepted those sponsorships on this show. Now that it is apparent, I can't in good conscience continue promoting it. So let's start with the basics on that point, and we'll work our way down. So here's a fairly straightforward but very important question that, by most estimates, 90% of Americans cannot answer. So let's say you log on to a major sports betting platform and you want to place a three-leg parlay, let's say. In other words, you want to make three different bets on one ticket. And if any one of those bets doesn't hit, then you lose all your money. That's the way it works. So, for example, the most popular parlay on FanDuel right now is that Kenneth Walker, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Ramondre Stevenson, and Stephon Diggs will all score a touchdown at some point during the Super Bowl. So that is a four-leg parlay. More than 8,000 people have placed bets on this particular parlay. If you bet $100 and all four players score touchdowns, you'll win $2,890. It's an extraordinarily high return for a relatively small investment, which is why the parlay has attracted so many people. But what are the odds that it actually hits? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that each of these players individually has roughly a 40% chance of scoring a touchdown during the game. It seems like a fair enough estimate. Well, based on this information, what are the odds that you'll turn your $100 into $2,800? If you had to give a ballpark estimate of your win probability on this parlay, what would it be? In other words, what are the odds that these 4 players will all score touchdowns if each player has a 40% chance of scoring a touchdown? The vast majority of adults and people who gamble can't give an accurate response to that question. Certainly, the vast majority of young people who are on these sites have no idea whatsoever. It's a math problem that isn't easy to solve unless you've been taught how to do it. Well, the answer is less than 3%, because you multiply the percents together, 40% times 40% times 40% times 40%, and you get to less than 3%. But actually, when it comes to parlays, the math is even worse than that, and here's why. On a normal bet, where you're only making one wager, the sportsbook will almost always add a house edge to the odds, otherwise known as juice. So, for example, imagine a 50-50 bet on an NFL game. If you bet $100 and lose, you'll lose $100. But if you bet $100 and win, you only make around $91 instead of $100. That $9 loss is the house edge, or the juice in gambling lingo. Now, in general, sports books bank around 5% of the total amount wagered on any bet, which is known as the hold percentage. On parlays, though, sports books bank far, far more than 5%. The more legs you add to your parlay, the more juice they get. As the Washington Post put it late last year, quote, as each leg is added to a parlay, the house edge is compounded. And by the time a 5th leg is added, the sports book's expected hold percentage has more than quadrupled from 4.5% on one leg to 20.8% on 5. Even though the potential payout rises as legs are added, the chances of winning are falling even faster. That's why operators love them. Here's an illustration of what that might look like in practice. Imagine a hypothetical 5-leg parlay without any juice, where you can bet $100 and earn $3,100 in profit. Well, when you add in the juice, you're only getting around $2,400 in profit. That's a loss of more than 20% of your profits to the juice, which is far more than your lost profits on a single bet, as we just discussed. Now, for many people who bet on parlays, none of this math is really obvious, because it's not obvious. It's kind of complicated. And certainly the betting sites don't make it obvious. They're not going out of their way to advertise all this stuff. It's very hard to compute the odds on parlays, particularly when the different legs involve the same game. What lures gamblers is the possibility of a very large payout for a relatively small bet, which is why parlays are by far the most common form of sports betting. Now, in New Jersey, according to the most recent data, parlays accounted for more than 80% of all wagers placed by bettors under the age of 24. Now, most states don't track that kind of information. It's very interesting information to have. Most states don't track it. But we could probably assume that they have similar numbers as well, which makes a lot of sense because you've got younger people whose brains are not fully developed yet. Their prefrontal cortex is not fully online yet, not until the age of 25. And they're placing these kinds of bets that a more rational and discerning person would realize it's not a good investment of your money. Now, you might be thinking, as I did, well, if the math is confusing and people don't realize that, then, no one's forcing them to make bets that they don't fully understand. It's up to you. It's up to you to look into this. It's not like you can find all this out. It might not be information that's put right in front of your face, but it's not hard to figure out if you want to. And that's up to you, right? Individual responsibility. And that's a fair point. I think it's a compelling point. It was my point for a long time. But here's the thing. Even if you're a competent gambler and you fully understand how parlays work and you math out the odds properly, you're still going to get cheated if you play long enough. The Economist recently ran a lengthy investigation into how sports betting companies identify skilled gamblers called sharps and losers who are called squares. And they use a series of algorithms to decide in real time if you know what you're doing. And if you're identified as a sharp, then you'll face restrictions on how much you can bet. In other words, the game is literally rigged against you. These limitations don't apply to many gamblers. Only around 0.6% percent of gamblers in Massachusetts are limited, just for example. But that's only because most gamblers lose money. Most gamblers don't know what they're doing. And the sports books know they're going to lose money almost immediately. Quote, the profiling process starts before you place a bet. Are you using a phone like most punters? Good. Or a computer, which makes it easier to compare odds? Not so good. Did you deposit by debit card or via the e-wallets preferred by syndicates? Are you a woman? That's suspicious. Far fewer women bet than men, and many sharps get women to place bets for them. The first wager you place speaks volumes. Normal gamblers bet on the most popular spectacles starting around half an hour before kickoff. They generally bet on who will win, what the scoring margin will be, and which statistical milestone a star player will achieve, paying little attention to the odds. Square players love to combine multiple bets into a parlay. Sharps have the opposite tendencies. They target less popular leagues and bet as soon as odds are published when they are most likely to be mispriced. They shop around. They like obscure derivative markets, such as how many points will be scored in the third quarter, and they bet on lesser-known players to perform poorly. They rarely use parlays. They make big deposits and seldom withdraw winnings. Now, this analysis is so reliable that according to consultants who work in the gambling industry, sportsbooks can determine the lifetime value of your account with 90% accuracy by the time you place your first bet. And indeed, companies like DraftKings take full advantage of this kind of information. Here's a quote from DraftKings CEO Jason Robbins explaining at a Bank of America event last September about why he believes that sportsbooks have advantages over prediction markets like Polymarket or Kalshi. And here's what he said, quote, it's going to be very difficult to ever have as full-featured an offering in a prediction market setup as you could in an online sportsbook. One of the chief reasons being risk management. When you're putting as a market maker, a market up on an exchange, you just have to be comfortable with anyone taking that liquidity. Anyone can fill that order versus we're able to place limits on sharps and other people. And that's the only reason we're able to offer the variety of bets and things that we can. This is a very important admission, and anyone who bets on sports should be aware of it. DraftKings is admitting that their moat, their competitive advantage over prediction markets like Polymarket, is that they will throttle the betting power of their most successful customers. They will shut you down if you start making too much money. This is the kind of thing that DraftKings investors like to hear because it shows that the company is protecting its profits, but it's not the kind of thing that DraftKings wants its customer base to really know about or focus on. So put simply, sportsbooks are often rigged against you in several different ways. The profits aren't anywhere near what they should be, particularly on parlays, which are much worse bets than most people realize. And if you start making too much money, they just shut you down. Now, in that respect, sportsbooks are very different from most forms of, actual investing. No brokerage on the planet will ban you if your portfolio increases. They want your portfolio to increase. And of course, most forms of investing are not all or nothing. If you invest in a typical S&P 500 EFT and it drops by 2% in one day, you haven't actually lost any money in a real sense unless you sell. There's always the possibility you'll regain your money. And based on the history of the stock market, you probably will. That might seem obvious to you, but for many people, especially young people, none of this is very obvious. They don't realize what they're getting into until it's far too late. Here's another quote from The Economist on that point. Quote, the NCAA survey found that 16% of 18 to 22-year-olds engage in problematic sports gambling. A poll conducted by Siena University in January found that a quarter of men who have gambled on sports say a friend or family member has expressed concern about their betting habits. Some 28% of 18 to 34-year-old men who use sports betting apps said that they have had trouble meeting a financial obligation because of a lost bet. That's pretty these numbers are staggering. I found this article to be really compelling when I read it for those reasons. There's also this new paper from the University of Oregon, which suggests that in states where sports betting is legal and the home team loses, in cases where the home team was the favorite to win, there's a larger degree of domestic violence compared to states where sports betting is not legal. Quote, using data from the 2011 to 2022 National Incident-Based Reporting System, we document that in states where sports betting has been legalized, the effect of upset losses on domestic violence is about 6 to 7 percentage points larger than in states without sports betting. Furthermore, we find that the effects are driven by home teams on a winning streak, states with legal mobile betting, Sundays right after paydays, and states with a larger betting market. The pattern of these findings confirms that the reaction to gambling laws explains our results. Now, on the surface, this finding makes sense intuitively. It's logical to conclude that people will care more about the outcome of sports of a game when they've bet on the game. And when people lose a lot of money, they're more likely to become upset. And people who are angry are more likely to commit acts of violence against people who happen to be around them. It's yet another reason to ban or at least heavily restrict sports gambling, or at least make it not as readily available as it currently is. But there's another aspect of this research that's worth talking about. You take a look at this chart from the appendix of the data prepared by these data scientists at the University of Oregon, which you can see right here. The purple line is the degree of domestic intimate partner violence, as they call it, in states without legalized sports betting. That's the control, basically. As you can see, the rate of domestic violence goes down very slightly when the home team wins a game they're expected to win. And it goes up very slightly when the home team loses a game they're expected to win, which is what you would expect with this correlation. Well, meanwhile, the orange line reflects states where sports gambling is legal. And in those states, as we just mentioned, domestic violence goes up significantly when the home team loses, despite being favored. But here's another interesting finding. The rate of domestic violence goes down by a much greater amount when the home team wins a game that they were favored to win. In other words, according to this research, the net effect of sports gambling is that there's actually less domestic violence overall. Men who might otherwise, do this, beat their wives, who bet on the home team when they're favored, refrain from committing domestic violence when they get a payout. And that happens more often than the alternative scenario by, some margin. Now, of course, you have to take any kind of data like this with a grain of salt. Certainly, maybe with a significantly large grain of salt. But in general, these findings are obviously unsettling, and the important takeaway is not really whether sports betting increases or decreases the risk of domestic violence. I'm sure you could start poking holes in this. The takeaway is just really the insane degree of emotional investment that sports betting encourages its users to have in the outcome of a football game or any other game. Now, even aside from domestic violence, certainly the vast majority of sports bettors are not abusing their spouses, obviously. But it just raises a question about whether it's a good thing for society to have so many people so deeply invested emotionally and financially in watching sports and so focused on it and distracted by it. I mean, I'm a sports fan, but is that making anyone's life better? On this show, we've discussed a lot of academic findings, most of which are nonsense or meaningless. But what we're seeing here is not nonsensical. It's a picture that is quite grim when you start really looking into it. And again, this is reminiscent of the problems affecting heavy marijuana users and the users of other drugs. Their relationships are destroyed. Their happiness or unhappiness is contingent on the drug. And once that happens, even if things go well for a little bit, inevitably it all collapses in the end. There's also a clear psychological component to gambling addiction, which is similar to what marijuana users experience. It's a compulsion that starts young in many cases. So here's a gambling addiction counselor describing a 15-year-old client who stole nearly $1 million from his grandmother and then spent it on FanDuel. Watch.
How old is your youngest client?
The youngest gambling client we had was 15.
15. And are you able to share any other story?
Sure. So he came from an Orthodox family. He was a great kid, great family support system. Mom called because he had been gambling. They thought that there was some shady stuff going on. So when I first started meeting with him, he was very secretive, didn't want to share anything, then started to share that he had stolen his parents' and his grandparents' social security numbers. He had 4 FanDuel accounts. 3 he got locked out of. When we got into the 4th account, which was under his grandmother's social security number, he had placed $887,000 in bets. And it was over a 12-month period. And when his mom and I went through that and we were looking, he was betting all day during school. He was betting at night when he was supposed to be sleeping. There was so many different bets. And on top of that, he had side bets going on in school with his peers. So then he was stealing the parents' credit cards And the way he would pay his bookies in school was to order Uber Eats for everybody, and he would pay them off with food. So there was he had all these different avenues to get money forwarded to him.
Now, this is an extreme case, obviously, but these kinds of cases, even if they don't rise to the level of a 15-year-old, stealing $1 million and betting it over the course of a 12-month period, even if they don't rise quite to that level, these kinds of cases are becoming increasingly common. And that is obvious when you start really looking into it. Dave Ramsey, who spends his time helping people manage debt, says it's the single biggest problem he's seeing at the moment. For their part, Vice just ran a documentary on the topic. Watch.
He's $300,000 in debt on credit cards. His wife just found out, and it's all sports betting, which is probably the fastest growing addictive problem that we're running into in the money world right now.
That's right.
Out of control sports betting. You can bet on whether they're going to dance backwards or forwards after a touchdown. You can bet on anything, right? Mm-hmm. And they are betting on everything, and it's out of control. Some of you are losing your entire futures to betting on watching someone else earn a living.
I won't say his name, but I know an individual. He's bet $4.3 million total, and he's my age.
A lot of young men are not just betting on sports, but betting recklessly and are developing a really problematic relationship to gambling and lose a lot of money.
I need to stop gambling.
But are you?
You're joking about it, but do you actually think you need to stop?
Yes, 100%. The problem is, this sounds bad, but I do have I work a lot. I make good money for my age. It's not ruining my life by any means. I still have enough money to go do what I want when I want, but it's definitely building habits that once I start making 60, 70, 80 plus grand a year, that the units are gonna go up, I'm gonna lose more, I'm gonna win more, and it's definitely a problem that has been a pattern in my family and that I've been told from a young age to stay away from. And I mean, for sake, I have a dice tattoo on my arm from my grandpa. He was a gambler. So yes, if we're gonna revert to the question, I would say it's definitely becoming a problem, and I would like to stop.
Now, in an ideal world, people could handle sports betting in a responsible fashion. They could bet a small amount of money, handful of times a year, and it would not affect their lives. People would treat it like a game, not a lifestyle, not an investment strategy, not a career path. And they would enjoy the game in moderation, never spending more than they can afford to lose, never being too emotionally invested in it, tied up in it. That's an ideal world. That's how, and there are people out there that's how they bet. I said I've placed bets in the past, and there's not even the inclination for this to become compulsive. It's it's not that fun. It's just every once in a while, just as an amusement, put a few bucks on a game. But that's just simply not what's actually happening at scale. Okay, it's not what's actually at scale. That ideal scenario is not what is really happening. And so we got to deal with what is really happening. The Supreme Court eliminated the federal nationwide ban on sports gambling back in 2018. Specifically, the court, with Justice Alito writing the opinion, struck down a federal law from 1992 that took the power to regulate gambling away from the states as unconstitutional under the 10th Amendment. So it's been almost 8 years. And anyone who supports sports gambling, I have just one question, but I want you to answer it honestly. This is the question I had to ask myself. After all that time, has the mass legalization and ready availability of online gambling improved the country in any way whatsoever? Has it achieved anything positive that anyone can point to? Well, I think it's impossible to answer yes to that question. It's easy to point to the negative effects, the money wasted, the time wasted, the relationships destroyed, lives ruined. All of that is real, only becoming more and more common. So what are the positive effects to counterbalance this? Are there any at all? Well, it seems clear that the answer is no. And therefore, we all need to ask, as I had to ask myself, why are we doing this? Why promote it? Why engage in it? Why endorse it? After a lot of thought, I've changed my answers on those questions, and if you're heavily invested in sports gambling for the sake of your relationships and your livelihood, I hope you do as well.